I'm really excited to be talking with Professor Valter Longo, a biogerontologist at USC, whose research on aging and genetics has been groundbreaking, and who is an expert in the area of fasting and longevity, and also the author of the book, The Longevity Diet. So welcome to the show, Dr. Longo. I'm looking really forward to talking to you, and I understand we're in similar parts of the world. You're in Italy and I'm in Greece, so we're in kind of the Mediterranean diet zone here. So welcome again to the show, and thank you.
Thanks, thank you.
You're very well known for something called the Fasting Mimicking Diet, and can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the fasting mimicking diet, we've been looking for diets and nutrition around the world, and whether it's Greece or Italy or Okinawa or Loma Linda. But I also realized that a lot of people, maybe the majority now, I think, for example, Italians, it may be only about 10-15% of Italians that do the Mediterranean diet, right? So most people stop doing the Mediterranean diet. And so the fasting mimicking diet is a plant-based 5-day program that has the job of mimicking fasting. So having the same effect as fasting on the human body, and helping people that don't necessarily adapt the ideal diet get closer to the health benefits that you will get with an ideal diet, right? So it's basically coming up with an alternative and saying, okay, you can have a perfect lifestyle, and maybe 10% of people or 5 to 10% of people have that. You could have drugs, but there's also another option that can be combined, of course, with a healthy lifestyle, but also for people that have to take drugs.
So it's more about food choices and not about periods of hours in the day for like intermittent fasting, for example. It's about food choices. It's about staying away from animal products, essentially, and focusing on a plant-based diet?
It's not food choices because, I have something that I call the longevity diet, right? So the longevity diet is about food choices, about how many hours per day you eat, and lots of different things. The fasting mimicking diet is more like a medicine in a box. But that box happens to contain only vegan and be very healthy for you, right? So it takes from the Mediterranean diet, from the Okinawa diet, from a lot of very healthy diets, but it's a very special composition that makes the body enter what we call fasting response mode, right? So, which you only enter if you, let's say, do water-only fasting. If you stayed, we only drank water for 5 days, you will enter that phase. But the great majority of the people, because of safety reasons and because of feasibility, they don't want to do water-only fasting. So the fasting mimicking diet allows most people to be able to go through and get the benefits of these 5 days without having to fast it.
So what sorts of foods would they be eating? Like, if in a practical sense, if I came to, is that something that one would do for specific health reasons, to address certain specific diseases, or is it something that you just want to do because you want to lose weight, or you want to get your blood pressure down, or whatever? What sorts of foods would you recommend?
Yeah, this is not a recommendation on food, because the fasting mimicking diet has been tested, I think, in 40 clinical trials, many universities around the world, some of the leading universities, in a very specific composition, right? But it's not a secret composition, but it's a very difficult composition to achieve. Right? So it's lots of vegetable, lots of nuts, olive oil. So all the ingredients that you can find, most of the ingredients you can find out there, but it's done in a way that it tricks the body into responding as if it was fasting, right? So it's not like you could just go and eat nuts and olive oil and you're gonna get the benefits. You just have to follow exactly.
Okay.
So if you look at the medical system as FDA, right, and the FDA requires a very consistent drug composition, and the same is true for food. But so now we're trying to introduce food as medicine. It is more closely connected to the medicine than in the past, right? So food can be medicine if you have the Mediterranean diet, great. But again, most people are not willing to do that, and so we're starting to think about food technology as a way to bring in more people to be healthy without having to change their lifestyle.
So when the body goes into this sort of fasting mode, what happens to it? Like what are the benefits of doing that?
The fasting mimicking diet does three things, right? And so a lot of the studies we did in mice and rodents to understand mechanisms, meaning how does it work, and then we do it in humans to prove that it works, right? So in humans, it's difficult to know exactly how it works. So we do that part in animal studies, right? So in animal studies, it shows very clearly three things. One is called autophagy. So the body begins to eat itself, right? And it shrinks, and in the process of shrinking, it clears a lot of damaged components. But it also sets the cells to begin re-expanding with new components, right? So you get rid of the old components, and then you begin rebuilding with the new components, right? So that makes it younger, right? Then the number two is what's called cellular reprogramming. The cell, most cells, or maybe all cells in the human body, can go into a reprogrammed modality, meaning that they can turn back into a young cell by turning on what's called Yamanaka factors, right? So Dr. Yamanaka got the Nobel Prize a few years ago for that. And so by activating certain genes, the cell goes back to zero, right? It goes back to a young cell. So that's number two. And we see a lot of evidence of cells going back to zero during the fasting mimicking diet. And number three is stem cells, right? There's these cells that can give rise to lots of cells, lots of different cells. And we see the level of stem cell increase, right? For example, we see the level of blood stem cells, bone marrow stem cells increase. And so, yeah, we think, of course, again, the demonstration for this is in animals, but then the demonstration that it works was in people. So now in people we see effects on, for example, 2.5 years of biological age reduction. So in 2 different clinical trials, people became 2.5 years younger, at least based on these markers that we measure. We now, University of Miami, for example, published that for colitis and fasting mimicking diet in plus drugs in people that had colitis, they did better than drugs alone. Now there's many trials for diabetes and pre-diabetes showing not just a management of the disease, but a regression of the disease. So patients, by just doing the FMD, the fasting mimicking diet once a month, they began about 60 to 70% of the patients in many trials regress, right? So they reduce drug use and they reduce A1C, so they become healthier. But I think the important thing is they don't just reduce A1C, so blood glucose, but they also reduce blood pressure, reduce cholesterol. So they're in fact becoming younger and more functional. And that's I think that's the big advantage over drugs, most of which can have lots of effects, but they can also have lots of side effects.
What intrigued you? How did you come upon this? Like, you started out in an earlier part of your life as a musician, if I'm wrong, right? If I'm correct. Sorry, if I'm correct. How did you embrace this? How did you stumble upon this? What intrigued you about this?
Well, yeah, I was a musician my first year in college, and in Texas, and but then I switched to biochemistry, and that's all I've ever done since, to study aging, right? So I didn't switch from biochemistry to aging. I switched to biochemistry to study aging, and so it's always been my passion. And I think the fasting comes in. I was a student of Roy Walford, and Roy Walford was a medical doctor at UCLA when I did my PhD, and he was working on something called calorie restriction in people, right? He started the first human trial on calorie restriction. So there was 100 years of studies on mice and rats and monkeys where if you reduce calorie intake by 25%, lots of organisms live longer. So he did the first human study while I was in his lab on calorie restriction. So that on one side, of course, I was inspired by the work by Walford and others, but on the other side, I started working with microorganisms, so bacteria and yeast. And I used to starve them, right? So I decided that I was very interested in starving microorganisms, and then I was observing if I starve bacteria, they live a lot longer. If I starve yeast, the baker's yeast, the yeast that is used to make bread, if I starve yeast, they live a lot longer. And so I started thinking there's something, if bacteria and yeast are both living longer by completely starving them, there's got to be something very powerful about this starvation. And maybe it's also connected with what Walford was doing by just calorie restricting the calorie by a quarter. That's all I've ever done, right? So now 1.5 billion people, I'm told by ChatGPT, fast nowadays. But back in the early 90s, when I started working on fasting, everyone thought it was the dumbest thing that anybody, including my own colleagues, right? They thought, why would you possibly starve yeast and bacteria? Who cares, right? So that was the attitude. Now that's very different. And aging was also viewed as a crazy field. Like, why would you study aging? And then on top of that, why would you study fasting and aging? So things have changed.
So, in the blue zones, one of the things that I found in just very empirical research on the island of Ikaria, where my family's from, when I wrote my first book, it was simply a cookbook, but I talked to a lot of older people on the island, and one of the things that impressed me the most was not so much what they were eating, but what they weren't eating, that their caloric intake when they were younger was much less than it is now. In sort of similar age groups, and their physical activity levels were, obviously much higher. But is there some correlation within, sort of like in practical terms, the way people actually live in their everyday lives? Is in the blue zones, is there some sense of like do people eat fewer calories in the blue zone? The older people, have they traditionally been eating fewer calories? Is that one of the things that might explain the longevity?
I think they probably happen to have a combination of lots of things. I always mention like Michael Phelps or people that have records, right, in the Olympics. You don't just to have a record, right? To get to 100 in a record number, you need it all, right? You need the genetics. You need the maybe being restricted when you were younger. You need to, the exercise. So they probably hit a lot of the right things without even realizing that they were hitting all the right things, right? And on top of that, like you mentioned that, right? So a lot of them starved during the wars and even after. But then when they turn 80 or 75, they start eating a lot more, because many of them moved in with their sons and daughters, right? And so we think that that's probably the phenomenon that got them so successful, that they underate for decades, and then they kind of overate, after a certain age. Phenomenon that are not necessarily seen in the United States and lots of other places, right? So Greece and Italy and all these communities, they tended to sort of take care of their elderly, and a lot of them, they were in Italy, almost everyone, right, that I know of was taken care of, either brought in the same home or very close to it. And so, and then if you observe their diet when they were 80, 90, 100, it was much richer than what they described for the rest of their lives, right? I always remember I was down in Calabria with a French television, and the French journalists were asking this lady who was 104 or something like that. So how many times did you eat meat when you were younger? And the lady didn't understand. And then finally she understood that she only spoke dialect, Calabrian dialect. She understood it. She started laughing. She's like, yeah, I ate meat one time when I got into a wedding, somebody else's wedding, and I was able to sort of steal the meat. And that was the only time she had meat for, maybe like a period of 40 years. Now, of course, she was 104, and for the past 20 years, she was eating meat maybe every other day. So very special combination of things, right? And I think it's probably what got this phenomenon in Greece and Italy and a few other places around the world to be so healthy and long lived. Phenomenon that is going away by now. By the way, right now Greece
It
and
is.
Italy are the in the last position, in the worst position for child obesity in Europe, right?
I
And the
know.
same area that
I know.
generated centenarians are now generating record overweight and obesity.
Yeah, I know. Here too. I see it. You see it everywhere. Um, in Greece, in the traditional diet and in the traditional, let's say, lifestyle, and this actually still happens today, people also fast for religious purposes. So, is there, and that's true of many cultures. I think, and I'm not sure about, in Catholicism in Italy, but how do traditional periods of food abstention, like Lent, compare to this, sort of the fasting mimicking that is your research? Like, how are there health effects that happen from the cultural reasons why people fast and the religious reasons why people fast? I mean, in Greece, I fast before Easter for 49 days. I go off all animal products. And I just know from my own body that what I feel is an increased ability to focus more, and I definitely feel lighter. I feel better. But I'm just wondering if is there any way to compare the effects of fasting for cultural and religious reasons versus fasting mimicking what your research is about?
Yeah, they're very, very different, So I always say things that come from the past, like the paleo diet, if you eat like the people ate in the Paleolithic, there are people that do that, right? A lot of people that do that. Fasting is a little bit like that, right? It will have benefits, let's say religious fasting, and it could cause damage, right? And depending who does it, when they do it, how they do it. So, for example, 40 days, right? I mean, if you look at long-term fasting, it's a bad idea for multiple reasons. Now we know that people that do yo-yo, right? So if you do long-term fasting, you're going to lose a lot of weight, and then you're going to gain a lot of weight, right? And if you do this more than a couple of times in your lifespan, you're going to live shorter, right? And that's based on lots of data, right? And yeah, so you get benefit, but that's not the point, right? The point is, am I going to get a long-term benefit, and am I going to get like long-term benefits that make me live longer? Otherwise, why go through, let's say, 10 days, 20 days, 30 days of fasting, right? So I think we need to move away. I mean, if somebody does it for religious reason, I think it's okay. I mean, nobody wants to argue that, somebody in Italy, we used to have the black fast, right, during Lent, and of course Muslims have Ramadan. Yeah, so if somebody does it for religious reasons, there is no recommendations against it, of course. But I think if somebody's looking for something that they can do to live longer, now you can learn from tradition, and that's very important. We always look for what the people do, what the religions. I mean, I think it's very important to learn and use that. But then you have to add all the science, epidemiology, clinical trials, basic research. How do you make a mouse live longer? How do you make a monkey live longer? Yeah, so then you bring it all together, you're respectful of what you learn from religions, and then you come up with a method, and that's where the fasting mimicking diet comes in, right? It's trying to avoid all the problems. Another problem, for example, is of what people do for religious reasons long term is metabolic slowdown, right? So in the old days, if you were fasting for a long time, your metabolism slowed down. And so you save energy. And in the old days, it was a good thing, right? Most people did not have excess food. And so slowing
Right.
down a metabolism was important to stay alive, right? At a certain point, that extra fat that people stored saved their lives, right? Nowadays, that extra fat kills you earlier, right? And so if you go into a low energy expenditure mode, and you would do that if you go 2, 3, 4 weeks of low food intake, now you slow your metabolism, your energy expenditure, and that slowing could last years, right? And this is where you hear some people saying, I'm not eating anything and I'm not losing weight, right? Well, they've probably entered this thrifty mode where the body is desperately trying to save all the energy possible, right? But yeah, again, in modern times, that's very bad, right? Because you don't want to save all the energy possible because it makes you sleepy, it makes you tired, and then it saves energy, right? You want the opposite, right? You want to, be active, burn more energy, and so you can, enjoy the food more, right? So yeah, so these are just some examples of the problems that come from just saying, oh, people have done it as the black fast for 1,000 years or more, and so it's a good thing. Not necessarily, right? It was a good thing maybe, and now maybe it's a bad thing, and you shouldn't do it.
What about intermittent fasting? Is that, would you encourage that? Is that something that, I do that often. I don't do it every day, but I pretty much try to live that way.
Yeah, so intermittent fasting, same problem, right? There is a correct way to do it and there's a bad way of doing it. So the correct way to do it, we think is between, and I have a lot of discussion with Sachin Panda and others about this, is between 12 and 13 hours a day, right? So between 12 and 13 hours a day of fasting, there is very little recommendations against, right? I always say, especially 12 hours, I've never heard a doctor or any publication say that's bad for you. To fast for 12 hours is bad for you. Now, keep in mind, people on average now eat for 14, 15 hours a day, right? At least in the United States. So going down to 12 food consumption, 12 hours of fasting, really great improvement. Now, and we know it has effects on sleep quality, it has effects on metabolism, on weight, etc., etc. Now, a lot of people do 16 hours, right? And of course, same problem, right? Say, okay, you do 16 hours, and people say, well, but now I'm feeling better. My blood pressure is lower, or whatever. It doesn't matter, right? Because the data shows in the long run, if you do 16 hours and skip breakfast, and most people, if they do 16 hours, skip breakfast, or if you do 16 hours and maybe even skip dinner, there's new data suggesting that even skipping dinner is going to shorten your life, right? And increase your cardiovascular disease, right? So the 12 hours seems to be associated with only positive effects, and the 16 hours and the breakfast skipping now started to be associated with bad effects, right? So you go from good 12 hours to potentially bad 16 hours, right? So yeah, again, the question of, is fasting good for you? Is intermittent fasting good for you? I think we and hopefully journalists move away from words like that because they include so many techniques, some of which are great and some of which are terrible. And people just tend to put them together. And then, a lot of people do 16 hours and that's clearly detrimental if breakfast skipping is involved.
Is there, that's really interesting. I do both. Personally, I usually do 12 to 13, but I don't eat breakfast. I'm not a morning eater, just my body. I'm just curious, what do you eat on a typical day?
I follow what I preach, right, and what I wrote in all my books, and so I start with this friselle from Altamura. There's a little town that is famous for its bread in Puglia, in southern Italy, and then I have especially made for me a almond spread. It's like cocoa and almond. The spread there's no junk in it. It's just almond
Right.
and chocolate basically. And then I have an apple, and that's my breakfast. In the morning. And then I usually, especially if I'm in Italy, I don't eat lunch. Then I have tea with whole grain bread in the afternoon, and then dinner is usually some type of minestrone. So it's a lot of legumes, fish, legumes, and whole grains, and lots of vegetables, like on rotation, right? So one day it'd be spinach, the other day it'd be broccoli, then it'd be mixed vegetables. Yeah, so yeah, maybe seven servings of fruits and vegetables.
No gorgonzola and prosciutto.
I add a very little Parmigiano to my pasta in the evening. So yeah, I should mention I eat the minestrone with about 70 grams of pasta. Yeah, I mean, I eat a little bit of Parmesan cheese in Parmigiano Reggiano, and but yeah, I don't eat very much cheese. Maybe once in a while, maybe once a week or so.
But do you eat meat at all?
I eat fish maybe 3 times a week, sometimes 4 times a week. Maybe white meat once a week, and red meat maybe once a month.
If I have one more question, it would be if there's anything in your research that struck, sort of like a personal chord with you, if there's something, a story that changed your own understanding of aging and disease, something that, even outside of a laboratory, something that you saw, through your research, something that somebody who's not a scientist, let's say, could relate to.
Yeah, I think by far probably this ability of fasting and fasting mimicking diet to shrink the body, and then in the re-expansion part, right, the part of the body renews itself, right? So that's something so simple, and something that I think that it was, it could have been pretty obvious, but surprisingly, nobody had worked on it before us, not in looking for multi-system regenerative processes. And yeah, so I think it's probably one of the most powerful ways to make a system younger and more functional, right? By doing it the right way, and allowing this shrinking and these re-expansions.
So, I mean, when you say shrinking, you literally mean losing weight?
Yeah, I mean like every organ, we know this also from animal studies, but also from human studies, every organ becomes smaller, right? So the liver becomes smaller, the lungs become smaller. Not a lot, the muscle, right? Temporarily, your muscle mass becomes a little bit smaller, and then it goes back to normal, right? So in the 40s, Enzo Keys in Minnesota had done this human semi-starvation studies. They will never be allowed again for the rest of humanity. But in the 40s, they allowed them, right? So they semi-starved people for a long time. And in some of the people that they semi-starved for weeks and weeks, the heart became 40% smaller, right? So, but the important thing is that after they refed them, let's say a couple months after, the heart went back to normal, right? So what happened now, 40% smaller and then normal, does that mean that 40% of the heart is new? Is it a 40% young heart and 60% old heart? I mean, this is how, really remarkable. So, I mean, we don't know the whole story, but it's possible, right? It's possible that, whether the cells get replaced or cellular components get replaced, now you have, a portion, a significant portion of the heart that is being renewed, right? And so, yeah, so that's still a lot of work to be done, but certainly very, very interesting.
Who were the subjects of that experiment?
It was in Minnesota, and it was volunteers, of course. And yeah, there's a lot of volunteers that they agreed to undergo these very low calorie diets for months and months. And of course, yeah, they became very, very thin. And this would be the kind of study that would never be allowed. You couldn't even propose it, right? Even if you did propose, it would never go through an ethics committee.
Again, for the lay people like me, can you, in simple terms, just explain the benefits of fasting? Why is fasting good for us?
Yeah. So I get asked that all the time, and I always say the same. I have the same answer, which is fast is good, bad, and neutral. Fasting, and but there are two types of fasting that I think are good, and one of them is 12 hours of fasting every day, and there are metabolic effects and positive effects and positive effects on sleep. And so, yeah, everybody I think should fast for 12 hours and eat for 12 hours. And the second one is maybe 3 cycles of a fasting mimicking diet, 5-day fasting mimicking diet per year. Now 40 clinical trials on that, and you know, it's very easy to read up on that and learn how to do it, and you can read it in the book.
So it's 5 days a year or 5 days a month?
No, it's three 5-day cycles per year, right? So it'd be 15 days total per year. And it has between 800 and 1100 kilocalories per day, right? So, yeah, you don't eat normally, but you eat a pretty good amount of calories. It's 100% vegan, and it's also 100% coming from blue zones or longevity areas of the world, meaning every ingredient is selected for being very much associated with longevity and a healthy lifespan.
Are there beans on that diet?
There are beans, but not very much, because beans are rich in proteins and amino acids, and for those 5 days we want to be low amino acid, low proteins, right? We don't want to be a high nourishment. It's the opposite. You have to take a break from nourishment so that you trigger all these regenerative and autophagy mechanisms.
I see. And if one does that, one should expect to have some sort of cell regeneration?
Well, one should expect on average to have about 2.5 years improvement in biological age, right? So become a little bit younger, and but also we see effects on cholesterol, we see effects on blood pressure in multiple trials, on a loss of fat, but no loss of lean body mass, right? So there's a big distinction between that and drugs that are out there and that are becoming very popular. A lot of these drugs that target GLP-1, for example, will cause weight loss, but a good portion of that is muscle and bone mass potentially, and we don't see that with the fasting mimicking diet cycles. So it's targeting specifically for obvious reason, right? It's mimicking fasting, and so during fasting you don't want to burn muscle, you want to burn fat, right? Because you store that for that purpose, right? So it's it's an evolved process, right? So we think of drugs as being sophisticated, but evolution is billions of years old and is much more sophisticated than drugs. You just have to learn how to do it correctly, right?
Okay, that's good to know.